everyone. Yes, thank you for the introduction, Devin, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Um, so this is just going over what we just spoke about. So this is a two-part series, and the second part of the series is 2 weeks from right now, same day of the week, same time. So these two presentations can be watched as standalones, but if you're newer to usage statistics or you think it might be helpful for you, I do recommend that you attend them both, and they're meant to complement each other. But if for whatever reason you can't attend the second one or can't attend this one, they of course will be recorded and uploaded to NC Live's YouTube channel in the future. Next slide. So our agenda for today, so again, part one is very much the basics. So we're just going to talk about what usage statistics are in general, what counter is, if you've ever heard of that. And then we're going to go more into the why in an intro to data gathering and analysis. And just a note for this presentation, I have notes and links included uh, in the PowerPoint itself, and that will be shared at a later date in case anyone finds that helpful. Next slide. So just a brief overview. I know NC Live has really great reach, and sometimes they have folks from other states attend these webinars. So as we mentioned, I'm with the State Library of North Carolina, and I'm particularly part of the Government and Heritage Libraries section. And so a lot of people are like, they might be familiar with their state library, but maybe not super familiar with what it does. And so for the purposes of this presentation, the important thing to know is that we do provide resources to the public, regular library services like anyone else. And we are a member of NC Live in their public libraries community of interest, just if that helps give you a little bit of context of who we are. And if you're interested, you can look us up online and our website and learn more about our resources, especially if you're in North Carolina, as both libraries and patrons. Uh, there are plenty of services that we offer to both populations. Next slide. All right, so when we talk about usage statistics, the definition, you can go pretty vague or you can go very detailed, but generally you're describing data points that demonstrate or describe how much and in what way a tool or resource is used. Um, so this presentation and what most people are referring to when they talk about usage statistics, they're usually talking about e-resources. But you could argue that you could say, like for your in-house checkouts, that is kind of technically also a usage statistics because you're saying how much are books being used in-house. But again, since this is mostly in the digital context, that's what we're going to focus on. Um, so, depending on your library, what sort of institution you're at, and your title, you may or may not have had experience with usage statistics because maybe you're more familiar with the physical use of something, whereas other positions like myself, who is a dedicated electronic resource librarian, I only focus on electronic use. And we'll talk about the why a little bit later. Next slide. So quick poll, again, the little link at the top, join at menti.com. This is Mentimeter, and then you can punch in that code and you will be able to, or you could scan this QR code on the screen. You'll be able to answer the poll I am asking and see everyone else's responses. So the first part of this question is, have you ever worked with electronic resource usage statistics?
And we'll just make sure if folks want to give a thumbs up, that they're ready to move to the poll itself. Just let me know. Oh, we have a raised hand here. Is this a question? Feel free to drop it in the chat. Poll says waiting for presenter. You got it. I'm going to the next slide. There we go. So everybody should see the question. Have you ever worked with e-resources usage stats before? If so, how often do you look at and report on usage stats?
Okay, nice. Yeah, I'll keep letting these responses roll in. And of course, these responses will be available post presentation as well. But it looks like most people on this call, thankfully, are familiar with e-resources and their usage statistics and at least have reported on them once, whether that's annually, quarterly, monthly. I feel like that is pretty common. Depending on what sort of library you're in, for example, if you're at an academic library, maybe you do it at the end of the year or every semester. Some people like to do quarterly. Some people might be at libraries who have very specific reporting standards and they want something every month. We'll talk a little bit more about frequency of reporting later, but there's no wrong answer here. So let's go ahead and move on. Thank you for responding. So the next part that we're going to talk about is counter. So I saw in the poll from the last slide that there are a couple people who are new to e-resources or who don't track them very often. So maybe you aren't so in the weeds. So hopefully you have heard of counter before, and it is literally an acronym. It stands for Counting Online Usage of Networked Electronic Resources. It's a not-for-profit organization. It was founded in 2003, and it is directly addressing the non-standardization of library usage statistics. And so Counter, in the greater organization, they published this big document, their code of practice, and it's a framework that they update and ask vendors to adopt so that they can make usage statistics reporting easier for libraries. And we're currently on Counter 5.1 that was released last April. Counter 5 was released in 2017. So if you have been in your role for a few years, you're probably really familiar with 5 and 5.1. They're not super different. So really great stuff. Counter is really well documented on their site in the code of practice. I recommend at least skimming sections 1 through 3, especially section 3. And the reason why I say that, and this is linked in the presentation, section 3 talks about what each of the metrics mean. If you have ever opened a counterport and you see all this lingo, it's very technical, it's structured, all the data looks very raw. It can be super confusing if you've never worked with e-resource stats before. And so I think the code of practice is written in a very sort of accessible kind of language. And so especially if you're new to your position, I definitely recommend at least skimming through it. Next slide. So the basics of a counter report is the report type, and it's broken down into platform, database, title, or item, of course, going large to small. And so the report type you choose really just depends on how granular you want to go and the kind of information you need. I personally like to stick around the database level just because we have so many offerings, and that is how the NC Live reports are structured. They're at a database level. But if you know, like for example, you're at an academic library and you're trying to make sure that a specific journal is being used, you might find a title report interesting to you. The next thing under that is the metric type. And so this is the meat of the report. And so it includes searches, requests, investigations, and sessions. And so the reason why there's an asterisk next to searches is because depending on the vendor and depending on the report, it may or may not split out federated searches. If you've ever seen that word before, it can get a little complicated and a little murky when you talk about federated searches. But the definition is basically it is a search that searches, quote, multiple data sources at a time. So one example of that could be like on your A to Z list, for example. If you have a widget that is linked to your Summon or your Alma instance, and somebody uses that widget to search for titles within your database, of course, it's going to count as a search, but because you're not really directly searching the database, it's considered a different entry point. But either way, you don't have to get too deep into the distinction between the two searches. Some people like to count them as a search, some people don't, but at least you do want to pay attention and make sure that if you decide you're not going to count federated searches, that all of your reports are consistent across the board. And then as for sessions, the reason why sessions also has an asterisk is because it is a legacy metric from Counter One reports. So technically, sessions are not part of the current Counter standard. However, many vendors know that libraries like that information and they like to report on it. So a lot of big vendors, they offer Counter One legacy reports that you can generate, or if you are working with a vendor that does not follow the Counter standard, they may or may not include sessions. So just a note there. And then, of course, with your metric type, you have a value. So that is the physical number of searches, number of requests, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, the counter report always has a header. So next slide. So this is directly from the code of practice. And this is demonstrating what a counter report looks like structurally. So of course, in the very top, rows 1 to 13, you have the header, and the header just tells you like your institution name, what report you are, what report you're using, what date you ran it, or what date range it's supposed to represent. And then, of course, you have your columns and then the body. And then the body is what most people are looking at, and that has your information of like database name, number of searches, number of investigations, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. And then I also wanted to point out, and this is also, of course, from the Code of Practice. Uh, so a lot of people, when they're new to usage statistics, they're like, what is a request? What is an investigation? Like, what does that word actually even mean, right? And it's very confusing. I completely understand. And so NC Live does a really great job of this. They have their data definitions on the website, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I really like this graphic. I like to have it handy because especially when you're explaining to leadership, for example, when you're doing your reporting and you say, hey, we got 1,000 requests this year for this particular database, chances are someone might ask, what is a request? What does that mean? And so for the counter definition, a request, also known as a full text view or a page view, is whenever someone downloads a full item, reads the full text online, or watches the full video. And then an investigation, and part of the reason why I love this graph is because it encompasses all of the requests in addition to viewing abstracts, viewing previews, link-to-link resolvers. And so when you're just looking through the report, because investigations encompass requests, a good rule of thumb is that investigations are usually the bigger number. Sometimes they're exactly the same, though. It just depends on how your users are using your database. Next slide. So I'm not going to go over this slide in the interest of time and just read it, but I have included it for convenience. So this is also available on NC Live's website, but this is their data definitions of what is a search, what is a session, what is a full text view, and it aligns very nicely with the last slide, the diagram. So we'll move on. The next thing I want to talk about, again, very briefly, is SUSHI. You may have heard it before. It is, again, another acronym, and it comes from the counter organization directly, and it stands for Standardized Usage Statistics Harvesting Initiative Protocol. And all that really means is that it retrieves the reports for you automatically, but you still have to like look at them and analyze it. So it uses a web request and API to get those counter reports. So especially if you are the only person who works with electronic resources, or if your library just has so many counter reports to look through every month or every year, I think SUSHI is something that's really good to look into just because it cuts out some of the work for reports that don't do auto email or non-counter reports. Next slide. So this is probably kind of wrapping up towards the end of us talking about counter. So I just wanted to put an example of what a counter report looks like, and hopefully you've seen something similar. And I've broken it up into two parts. The top half that's in that red box, that is the header information. And like I said earlier, it's very basic stuff. It just tells me what type of report, what version of counter, what institution I'm in, what date am I looking at? And then the bottom half is the meat. So this is for Gale, our Gale report, and we currently only subscribe to 19th century US newspapers. And so at the bottom, it tells us the database name, what metric type, and then how many we got for November of 2025. Next slide. So I've kind of mentioned this a little bit. There you will encounter reports in a non-counter standard. Not all vendors use counter, but a lot of them use a similar structure just because it's so popular and it's accessible among the library world. The main drawback, though, is that it's not in the same format as other reports, so it may require extra data manipulation and cleanup, which kind of we'll go into the analysis part and we'll start talking about that later. But for the most part, I personally haven't encountered major problems with non-counter standard reports. And another thing I will note is that there are some vendors who have reports that look very counter compliant, but because they aren't actually counter compliant, they cannot claim so, and therefore the report is not labeled as a counter report. So again, something just to note, but I personally don't think I've had a major issue with non-counter reports. Next slide. So for the second half of the presentation, now that we've kind of gone over the basics, we're going to talk about data collection. For the most part, I think when I was starting in my role, data collection to me was just downloading the counter reports, making sure they looked good, and then saving them to a drive, which is fine and great. And, you can use them as tools to say, like, hey, this is the report note for November. This is how many searches we got. Like, you can still get a lot of really great insights. But the purpose of this presentation and this two-part webinar is for us to take those pre-generated reports to kind of another level. And so that starts from data collection onwards. So some best practices here is generally more data is better. And the caveat I have with this point is that data collection does take time, and most of us are very, very busy. So here's the thing. You don't have to use all the data you collect, but when you're starting out, it's better to collect more and decide you don't want to analyze it or it's not useful to you than to not have it. Because if you don't have it, you'll have to go back and collect it again. So especially if like you're new to the role or you've never really worked with counter reports before, collecting all the data you can is probably what I would suggest. But if you are maybe like a rock star data analyst and you know that you don't need a certain data point just because your library doesn't report on it, feel free to not waste your time and leave it out. And then the next point is really important. You want to collect the same data over a period of time. So what that means is if you know that your library likes to report at the database level, you want to make sure that all of your counter reports are at the database level and not one at platform, one at database, one at title level, because then it just muddies the waters. And then also you want to make sure your time periods are consistent so that you don't have overlapping or duplicate data. And what I mean by that is especially for the folks who report quarterly, I think it would be easier if you collect monthly reports. So that way you can add or subtract numbers where you need to, as opposed to having like a quarterly report here, a quarterly report there. Just make sure that whatever you decide to collect, whether that's monthly or yearly, that you're able to determine what data goes where, or that if you decide you're only going to collect data once a year, like stick to it. Just do it once a year or once a month. Just be very consistent. And then my last tip is to create a master sheet. And so this is very open-ended. This can look like whatever you want it to look like, but basically you just want to have a centralized area to add each month's numbers. And I find that helpful so that you have to do less work at the end of the year to aggregate it all together. And I also find that when you add numbers month to month on a master sheet, it helps you go ahead and identify patterns and also determine if you have any sort of anomalies, maybe like the report didn't generate correctly. And so instead of catching that at the end of the year, catching it at the end of the month, it's a lot easier to fix. And also, It can be really annoying at the end of the year to have 12 counter reports and 12 different spreadsheets and combine them all at once. But if you do it a month at a time, then it seems a lot more manageable. Next slide. So once you've collected all of your data and put it into whatever format that you like, you have to do a lot of cleaning and normalization before you analyze. And this step is crucial. It is crucial because if you don't, it will be really hard to analyze later, and chances are you might make a mistake and misrepresent your numbers, which is the last thing you want to do. So an example of data cleaning is like whole numbers versus decimals. Um, if you decide you want to use decimals, figure out how many points you want to use, one, two, three, or if you decide to use whole numbers, just make sure that all of your numbers across the sheet are whole numbers. You don't want to have a mix because then it becomes harder to read, in my opinion. And also sometimes if you decide to use more advanced data analysis software like Power BI, for example, sometimes those sort of programs can get kind of mad when they don't match the same format. And so keeping it as clean as possible from the get-go, I think is really, really helpful. And then an example of normalization is in this fold 3 example. Um, Depending on the report, it might spit out everything in uppercase, everything in lowercase. You might have an extra space here or there. And again, if you decide to do more advanced data analysis in the future, sometimes it will consider all 4 of those versions of fold 3 you see on the screen as different versions, which can be really annoying. And also with white spaces, sometimes you will be looking for something in your spreadsheet, you can't find it, and then next thing you know, it's because there was an extra space or a period or like something like that. So making sure that all of your proper names look good, making sure that everything is spelled correctly is really important so that you can find things later. And then the other point I want to make is you want to make sure that your missing values are accounted for. And so again, this is why I recommend having a master spreadsheet because some reports, especially non-counter reports, they will omit the line if the value is 0. So if a particular database, for example, doesn't get any searches for that month, that line just doesn't show up, which is a little bit annoying. And this can become a problem later because when you're trying to, at the end of the year, for example, report and say, hey, this is the average amount of searches we got for this database per month. If for some reason you only have 11 months of data because one of the months was omitted because the value was 0, either adding a 0 or removing a 0 from your average, dividing it by 12, of course, dividing it by the number of months in a year, it can raise or lower average, which then makes your data point inaccurate and a misrepresentation, which of course is the last thing you want to do. Like you want to make sure the reporting you're doing is accurate. So making sure that if you have missing values, you either add in a 0 where the report doesn't, or you decide if it's not a 0, accounting that, for example, there are some reports that don't include investigations. Could you put like a non-applicable there? Like you need to be able to explain why that cell is blank. Next slide. And then again, continuing before you analyze, after you've cleaned all your data, everything looks good. You want to start asking some questions. So instead of diving headfirst into analysis, you want a goal. And ideally, you want to kind of know what your goal is before you even start collecting data. But if you're new, it can be really hard sometimes, I think, to decide what you're looking for until you have the numbers in front of you and you're able to see some patterns maybe. So throughout this whole process, like you definitely just want to keep thinking about what do I want to know? What do I need to report? And then the second part of that is this information directly reported on or does it need to be worked out? And what I mean by this is some statistics are easy. Searches, for example, they come through the report and it will tell you directly this database got 200 searches per month. Great. You can just report that and say, add them all up for the year and say, we got 10,000 searches for this database per year. Other metrics, for example, like cost per search, you have to calculate them post-report because that's not included in a report. So now you have to know how many searches you got in the year, how much the database costs, divide it together, do a little math. So that's something that I would call that would need to be worked out, if that makes sense. Next slide. So before we move forward, I know I've been dumping a lot of data. I kind of want to know what questions you're most often trying to answer with usage data. And hopefully the stuff I've presented on so far has kind of got your brain working of thinking about how your workflows have been so far. So love to see what people are saying. All right. Feel free to keep going on this. We've got some great ones. Definitely a lot of cost per use I see here. That's a big one that I'm asked about. Some people are talking about having to answer ACRL surveys, which, of course, if it applies to your institution, sometimes you have to do them, of course. So definitely great. Some stuff about how often something is being used, new versus reoccurring visitors, definitely great stuff. Yeah, so let's move on to the next slide. So, to kind of tie into the last poll, I want to ask another one before we keep talking. So, I want to know, how does usage data inform or connect to your library's strategic plan and or academic programs? And the reason why I ask this is because I find that the last question and this question are a lot of times very interconnected, and sometimes it can be a lot easier to realize that, and it'll help you start thinking about what new questions you want to ask about your usage stats in the future. Nice. We got some great answers rolling in for sure. Talking about the efficacy of resources and also justifying cost. That is a big one, especially with budget constraints. And this ties in with the last question about everyone saying they want to know cost per use. Of course, wanting to know if a resource is quote unquote worth it or worth the money is always like a very, very big concern for libraries because we want to try to stretch our dollars as much as possible. So definitely really great responses here. Totally on board. Let's move on. So this presentation, of course, is about the basics and talking about developing our story, whereas the next part, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is about analysis and kind of finishing our story. And so, um, one thing I think is really important when we're talking about usage statistics is reporting on more than just a number. And so having context for that information and deciding, what is the story here? And so, for example, if a resource has high cost per use, does that mean that you should cancel it? Does that mean that the resource is not worth it? It's kind of hard to say just from one data point, yes or no, because for example, you might decide, this resource is really in scope, it's really popular, yes, it's really expensive, but XYZ, and finding other reasons to kind of justify either to cancel or to keep it. And so, of course, that ties into the second point of saying, what do these numbers tell us? Even if something has a high cost per use, maybe its usage has increased compared to the last year. And so even though the cost per search is still high, it is lower than it was last year. Or this resource is expensive, but it's more popular than another resource that is kind of in the same sort of like subject area. So maybe even though it's expensive, you might cancel the less popular resource instead. And so, of course, while even though I think having context and information is really important to wrap around these data points, I think it's hard to say, of course, that you should just keep everything because you can't. And when resources are low use, of course, it makes sense to say, oh, we should cancel them. People are using that. But before making hasty decisions, I might suggest, of course, as e-resource librarians, you know, being data driven and saying to your leadership, like, yes, we have the data to support keeping this, or no, we don't have the data to support keeping it, and we should cancel, or saying, this data is kind of somewhere in the middle and it's maybe super expensive, but people like using it. Could we switch to an alternative, or could we maybe lower the package we have? And so, kind of taking a holistic approach rather than just saying low use, cancel. Next slide. So, to kind of help you with that and help you start developing kind of what story you want to tell with your usage stats, here are some questions you may want to start asking about your resource. And again, low use doesn't really mean anything without context, especially if you're reporting to folks outside of the library. When you say, oh, this gets low use, do your patrons know what that means? So some questions are like, is this resource available at institutions nearby? And is it accessible? Is there a lot of like double dipping or overlap? And maybe one of you can cancel it and one of you can keep it. Is it a good value for the price? This is a really big question, but just something to think about. Um, is the resource aligned with your strategic plan or academic programs? Is it within scope or mission, or is it a resource that covers a subject area that desperately needs more resources? Is it new? Are patrons aware of it? If you maybe haven't publicized it a lot or people don't know how to use it, even if it's a great resource, if someone doesn't know how to use it, they're not going to use it. So is there something you could do, such as promotion or training webinars that maybe might bump up its usage instead of canceling it and giving it another year? Is only one metric point low, or is all of it low? And then again, comparing it to other resources, do you have two or more databases in the same subject area? Could you cancel one and keep the other? Or could you decide, like, hey, this is a great resource, but let's get a cheaper alternative? And then, of course, especially with things like journals, for example, is it redundant? We have a couple of e-journals that we get in print, and the electronic version is free as part of the package. And so even though the electronic version doesn't get much use, we don't cancel it just because it comes with the print. And so there's not really anything to cancel. And so that, of course, is something you might encounter as well. And so an example of like me thinking through these questions is the state library, we serve state agencies and their employees. Um, Most of the folks who use our library resources love to come to us because we have a lot of like family history and genealogy resources. But of course, we are the official depository for state documents. So that's a great one too. But we have a couple of databases, for example, that aren't as popular with the general population, but serve really important content gaps for the state agencies because not all state agencies have dedicated libraries. And so keeping those materials are really important to us, even though on the surface it might seem like nobody is using them or that it doesn't fit within our patron mission, even though it actually does. Um, so again, just these are things to definitely think about. And of course, you don't have to answer all of these questions, but being able to answer a couple of them, I think, will help you get on the right track. Next slide. So this is the last poll, and this is us kind of getting to the closing of the presentation of the first half. And I want to know what's a question that you know usage data could help you answer, but you're not sure how to get there yet. Or maybe what is a question you know usage data could answer for you, but you're not sure how to flesh it out or maybe make it a little more of like a true narrative. All right, I'll give it folks a few more seconds. And if you're not comfortable with the Mentimeter, of course, the chat is always open. But from some of the responses I'm seeing so far, for sure, who's using what resources? Is it a super user? Is it a bunch of people doing small searches? That's always really valuable information, but it's super tricky to kind of find out. Usage to support library funding is a big one, especially if you are at a library that is funded by potential sources or has input from people who are not librarians or in the library world. It's really important to be able to kind of develop a story and explain it to non-library populations for sure. Usage data to get out of big package deals. Of course. Yeah. If you can decide that there's a lot of like overlap between your resources or there's a lot of redundancy, having that information available can be super, super helpful to decide like where can we cut costs. All right. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So I know I kind of blew through that presentation, but thankfully now we have plenty of time for questions. So what we covered in this presentation, of course, was the basics of what are usage statistics. We covered counter, and then we covered data collection and starting to develop your story and thinking about, okay, how can I use these numbers to justify renewals, cancellations, funding increases? Like what is the means to the end here and what am I trying to say? Like what are these numbers telling me? And so part two, of course, is us going to start talking about how to analyze those numbers using visualizations and graphics. And then, of course, like finishing out that narrative and saying, here are the numbers we got for this year. Here's what it tells us. And here is what we should do with this information. So that'll close out very nicely. Next slide. All right. Does anyone have any questions? We have plenty of time. And then I encourage you, if for some reason you have a question later on, if you want to go to the next slide, Devin, you are welcome to email either me or Devin. And then, of course, if you have not registered or if you've already registered for the next part, we will take feedback there as well. So if you have any questions that you think might tie in with part two, I'm happy to review them and hopefully address them during that presentation. But of course, I am open for questions now.
It looks like we got somebody in the chat asking, because of a Mentimeter response earlier, who's using Blue Cloud for e-resource usage. So if that person wants to share, yes, the slides in the recording will be sent out tomorrow with a feedback survey. And I'll also include the registration for part two. It looks like we have two people in the chat kind of sharing how usage stats can inform accreditors and be part of the accreditation process. We actually hosted a webinar in September that was led by a community college library director in North Carolina about being part of the QEP process and pulling in usage stats and other library materials related to accreditation. If you want to reach out to me, I can always send the recording of that, but that's on our YouTube channel as well. Carol is asking, is there a product that takes counter reports and plugs the numbers you want into a new spreadsheet, or do you have to put them in one by one?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I think unfortunately there's not a product that I know of, and if there is one, I don't know if it would be free. So I think if you're able to get Sushi set up, which is just retrieving those counter reports, I think that is fantastic because retrieving the reports, if you have to download them manually, does take a significant amount of time. But as far as like plugging them all together into the master spreadsheet, a lot of that is still manual, unfortunately. But what's great about being part of NC Live, and I don't know if you are, um, all of the NC Live products, that work is done for you on the usage statistics on the reporter. Daniel has done a really great job building that out. And so, at least in the case for us for the state library, we use the NC Live report for most of our products. And then whatever else we supplement with that is not included in NC Live, we just add those to that master spreadsheet. So, sorry if that's not super helpful, but it is a lot of manual work.
Nice. So ostensibly, Carol could download the usage report as a spreadsheet for her library from our portal and then add in the locally licensed resources that her library subscribes to. Got you.
100%. Yeah. With the way that Daniel has it set up at NC Live, if you use the NC Live reports, if you download it as a spreadsheet, which is what I do, they have it where it's database, sessions, and then searches, requests, and investigations. You can just keep adding down rows and then use that as your master spreadsheet with as you like, or you can make your own. Whatever workflow works for you. The great thing about counter reports is that you can really do whatever you want with them, which can be really intimidating at the beginning, but there's no right or wrong way to do it for sure.
Nice. Any other questions? I do want to echo Taylor and say you provided such a thoughtful overview of Counter and how things are structured in a way that um, Counter and Sushi were just a complete mystery to me when I started off in library school. So this would have been so helpful years ago.
Always, thank you for the praise. And then, of course, since it looks like we don't have very many more questions, again, when Devin sends out the recording and presentation tomorrow, like please feel free to ask as many questions, or if you have any feedback or information that you think would be helpful for part two, I'm definitely taking that into account as I'm still working on fleshing it out. So please use the feedback form, email us directly, or if you register, you can put that information there as well. So I hope we'll see you all in part two. And if anyone couldn't make it today, like your colleagues, I highly recommend them watching this webinar or at least coming to part two if they can.
All right. Thank you so much again, Anna. Folks, keep an eye out for an email from me tomorrow, and I hope to see you at part two in 2 weeks. All right. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Take care, everybody.